Hello, folks. Welcome in. Thanks for everyone's patience. We've just been giving a couple of minutes to get people onto the call. Welcome to our annual public meeting. I am Andrea Gress. I'm a communications coordinator with Birds Canada, and I also host the Warblers podcast. And I'm going to be your host here today. Now, before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping points. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded. Secondly, for those wanting access to French translation, in your webinar controls at the bottom of the screen, click Interpretation, and then select the language that you would like to hear. And an optional feature, if you'd like to hear just the interpreted language only, you can click Mute Original Audio. I hope that sets everyone up for success. Today, I will be joined by a number of experts who will be able to help us explore and learn more about the state of Canada's birds. But before we get too deep into it, I would like to introduce our Interim Vice President of Science and Monitoring, Pete Davidson, to lead a land acknowledgement and a brief introduction. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Andrea, and a very warm welcome to you all. It is my privilege to offer the land acknowledgement to start this Birds Canada annual public meeting. We are gathered today remotely, so I will contextualise this acknowledgement for our national headquarters and first recognise that I am speaking to you from Humatsetsum, an important cultural mountain overlooking Hwakwam, the place of the female Merganser, on the territories of Hulkaminam-speaking Cowichan and Penelakut tribes on Salt Spring Island on the Pacific coast. Birds Canada's headquarters are on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Adewandaron, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas, and on the territory of Mississaugas of the Credit under Treaty 3, signed in 1792. Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are crucial to maintaining the health of ecosystems and the birds that depend upon them. And we strongly support the needs and rights of Indigenous peoples to care for the land. As we reflect on the work of the Birds Canada community today, we have a special opportunity to see how birds, nature, and a love of our lands and waters provide a catalyst for Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to come together. I encourage all of us to take time to recognise the Indigenous nations and peoples whose territories we live and work on and engage with them. If you do not know whose land you are on, I encourage you to find out by going to nativeland.ca. A shared love of birds and nature is powerful motivation to take meaningful steps towards advancing the goals and calls to action highlighted by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thank you. Wow, it is humbling to see how many have tuned in. There's a number on my screen. I think it says well over 350. I think this is the largest virtual flock I've ever been a part of. Birds really do connect, don't they? Across borders, nations, oceans, continents, and across generations too. They bring us unbridled joy and they bring us great purpose. Across the country, there are tens of thousands of supporters, volunteers, and donors like yourselves contributing with passion and commitment to our citizen science and stewardship programs. Thank you for taking the time to be here today and every day. Together with you, we are an increasingly loud voice for birds. I'd like to spend a moment sharing a few of Birds Canada's exciting impacts from this past year. I only have time to touch on a few highlights, so look out for our packed annual report coming to your inbox soon. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the recently released State of Canada's Birds Report 2024, an amazing new resource that has been years in the making. It sounds the alarm for 168 species that have declined in Canada over the last 50 years, focusing in on the bird groups of highest concern, most notably grassland birds. At the same time, it highlights that knowledge is power, and where we have taken action, we're seeing positive impact toward halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. Grasslands, for example. Our amazing Prairie team continues to grow an innovative program linking corporate, government, private, and NGO partners to implement policies that work and a bird friendliness index that helps farmers and landowners demonstrate the value of the bird habitat that they steward, like the Hodgins family farm in Lenore, Manitoba. Do check out their great story on our website if you haven't already. We've been engaging with Indigenous communities, nations, and governments in the North to provide support on bird science where it helps them advance their priorities and interests. From Umushkego in James Bay to Nunatsiavut and Nunatakavut in Eastern Labrador, where there's a keen interest in using the Moses Wildlife Tracking System to learn more about important food and cultural bird species. Some of our largest partnerships are our breeding bird atlases, active in 3 provinces, with the first ever Saskatchewan atlas now very close to final publication, Newfoundland's first bird atlas close to wrapping up its fieldwork phase, and Ontario well into its 3rd atlas, perhaps the first province or state to reach that milestone in North America. I was lucky enough to visit Newfoundland in September, where our lead there, Catherine Dale, who runs our program, introduced me to one of the regional coordinators for the Atlas, who just 4 or 5 years ago was not really birding at all, and is now getting regular work as a bird surveyor. What a brilliant story. Internationally, we're growing new partnerships to conserve bird habitat for our long-distance migratory species, working with BirdLife International, Audubon, American Bird Conservancy, and the Latin American and Caribbean Network of Environmental Funds, with the ambitious goal of protecting 200 million hectares of priority bird areas. Some of our staff, including President and CEO Patrick Nadeau, who's not with us personally today, but is in spirit, have spent the last couple of weeks at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's COP16 event in Colombia, pushing Canada and our partners to commit more to halting and reversing biodiversity loss. There's lots more coming up from my colleagues, many of whom are here on the screen today. But before I hand it off, we collectively want to say a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you for your dedication, your generosity, and your passion. We're all in this together, and we most certainly couldn't do it without you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete. What a wonderful summary of projects. And I'm sure many of the people tuning in here today have had a hand in those, whether you've contributed directly or indirectly. So just thank you so much. Now, we're going to move on to our core presentation shortly. But before we do, we love to hear from you. So I want to make sure you know how to interact and engage with us. There is a chat feature as part of this webinar. So you should be able to find that near the bottom of your screen and just send in general comments as you have them. So I'll get you to test that out with 2 questions. You can answer one or both. Firstly, what's your favorite bird? Now, if that's too hard or too easy, I don't know. We'd also love to hear maybe if you've had a highlight bird in the last couple of weeks or months during migration, or hey, if you've been on vacation somewhere, let us know if you've had a recent bird highlight. Test out that chat function. So that's the chat. General comments can go there. And again, we'd love to hear from you. But if you have specific questions throughout the presentation that you would like answered live, please submit those through the Q&A box. We've got a team of people monitoring behind the scenes. They're going to be keeping tabs on these, but they won't be monitoring the chat for questions. So I'll say it again. If you want your question to be answered, submit it through the Q&A function. And again, you should find that at the bottom of your screen. Right on. I see some comments coming in. We've got loon. That's got to be a favorite bird. Thrushes, blue jays. I love it, guys. I love it. Thank you so much for engaging. Now, on to our main event. I'd like to introduce Kyle Horner, our Nature Counts Engagement Coordinator. He has been working behind the scenes on the state of Canada's birds for many, many months, and he is so keen to share some major findings with you. Over to you, Kyle.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you to everybody who has joined us today. You're absolutely right in saying that I am keen to share a little bit about State of Canada's birds. It's been a very big part of my life for a little while now, and I'm excited that it can be a part of other people's lives too. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. We'll start with an introduction, a general overview of State of Canada's birds, what it is and what it has to tell us. And then, as Andrea says, we'll have some time for Q&A, and we'll be able to deal with all of your burning State of Canada's birds questions. But before we get started, the first thing you should know about the State of Canada's birds is that it is a partnership between Birds Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. It's a virtual online resource hosted on Birds Canada's Nature Counts platform. And basically, it seeks to answer the question, how are birds in Canada doing? And it's a simple question, but as you can imagine, it's not that simple to answer. And the State of Canada's birds does that in two ways. There are two parts to this resource. I think of them a little bit like siblings because they share their DNA. They were sort of raised by the same people, but they're very different when you look at them and when you interact with them. On the one side, we have the report. And this is the part that maybe you're more likely to have seen already if you've been following our social media or any of the media coverage of the State of Canada's birds. This is a very approachable and digestible summary, a big broad summary with all the sort of key points that you need to know about what's going on with the State of Canada's birds. On the flip side, we have the species accounts. There is a species account for every species of bird which regularly occurs in Canada. That's 463 accounts, and they are chock full of detail, of data, and of expert analysis presenting the best state of our knowledge on that species of bird as of right now. So if you love detail and you love digging into the nitty gritty, the accounts may be for you. But if you're just starting to sort of dip your toe into the State of Canada's birds, the place to start is with that report. And that's what we're going to do today, because it does give us that big, broad picture, those sort of key points about Canada's birds. And when you dive into the report, the first thing that is going to greet you is a graph that may look a little bit familiar. And I should have mentioned that we're going to look at some graphs today. I know they're not everybody's favorite thing, but we'll make it as pain-free as possible to look at some of these very stylish graphs from the State of Canada's birds. And this first one may look familiar if you read the previous State of Canada's birds reports. So there was one in 2019 and one in 2012, and they both featured a graph like this. And we affectionately refer to this as the spaghetti plot. And the spaghetti plot really sets the tone for the State of Canada's birds report because it introduces these 10 groups of birds, which each tell an important story. And what it shows is the change in the populations of these groups of birds over time, starting in 1970 when our good, reliable bird monitoring data begins. And we can see that some groups have done quite well since the 1970s. Some have done okay, some not so well for sure. And that's something we're going to dive into in just a moment. But this graph really sets the tone. The other thing that we see up front is a breakdown of our species in Canada based on how they have done in those last 50 years or so. And we can see that about a third of our species, maybe surprisingly actually, have increased in their populations since 1970. So that's good news. Some of our birds are doing fairly well, and that's great to see. Maybe a bit less surprising is that over a third of our species in Canada have decreased or declined in their population since 1970. So that's, of course, very concerning. 12% of our species, it's worth noting, are what we call data deficient, meaning we simply don't have enough information to know whether they're increasing or decreasing. And I think, we tend to think of birds as being a group that's very well studied and well understood, but even within that group, there are gaps in our knowledge and we need to keep learning more about the birds that call Canada home. Now, the report gives each of these groups a full treatment. We don't quite have time to do that today. I hope that you will explore the report yourselves and see what you can learn about each of these groups of birds. But what we are going to do is look at what I think are the top 5 most important stories or talking points from the State of Canada's birds. So if you take nothing else away from this report, you can take these 5 key talking points. I think they're very important. So here we go. We'll start with point number 1. And if you pressed me and you made me pick the most important story from this report, I probably would pick this one, and that is that our grassland birds in Canada are in crisis. They're in trouble. This is the graph from the grassland birds section of the report. You'll notice it doesn't have one line, but in fact 3 lines on it. And that's because for some of these groups, we break them apart into smaller subgroups, which help to understand the story. And so we see in the middle here, that main group, that's the grassland birds as a whole, and they've declined on average by 67% since 1970. That's 2/3. That's obviously very worrying. But even more worrying than that is the line below it. That line represents our native grassland dependent birds. So birds that really rely on those native prairie grasslands. And we can see that even they specifically, I should say, have declined on average by 90%. 90%. Some species, like our lovely chestnut collared longspur here, have declined by over 95%. So this is a group of birds that is absolutely disappearing. The reason for that disappearance, the main issue for these birds, without a doubt, is their habitat, is those native prairie grasslands that they need. Those grasslands are in trouble. It's easy to think of the prairies as a big expanse of grassland, and at one time it certainly was, but those grasslands have been converted for agriculture, paved for roads and development, used for resource extraction. They're all broken up and they're disappearing. And so to save grassland birds, we need to save the grasslands that they depend on. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that later on. Our second story, also not a particularly good news story, has to do with shorebirds. Now, we knew that shorebirds were declining. They have been declining for some time. And this report reinforces that. We know that shorebirds are continuing to decline. Now, our shorebird data, it actually begins a little later than those other species. We don't have good shorebird data back past about 1980. But even in that shorter time period, these birds have declined by about 42% on average. So that's a considerable decline as well. Now, shorebirds face a number of issues, but this is one group where climate change is really rearing its head. When we think about shorebirds in Canada, the vast majority of them, they nest in one of 2 places, either in the Arctic tundra or in wetlands on the prairies. And both of these places are being impacted by climate change. Shorebirds that nest in the Arctic, they make that long journey way up to the far north for a very good reason, and that is to take advantage of the emergence of insects and in some cases berries in the Arctic summer. It's a really rich food source and they rely on it for raising their young. But climate change is altering the timing of these emergences. And so now the timing of the birds' migration and the timing of those food resources don't necessarily match up, and that can be a real problem for birds that breed in the Arctic. In prairie wetlands, the big issue is drought. Prairie wetlands go through a natural drought cycle, but climate change is making those droughts worse and more frequent. And so that is a real problem for birds that rely on the prairie wetlands. And so shorebirds are a complex group, and it will take complex solutions to help reverse this decline. Our third story is what we all expected to be another bad news story, to be quite honest. This is the aerial insectivores. So these are birds which fly around in the air and catch insects on the wing, like our lovely bank swallow here, like swifts and nightjars and flycatchers. And if you are sort of tuned into birds in Canada, and probably all across North America, you likely have heard that aerial insectivores are in trouble. They've been ringing alarm bells for over a decade now. We know that this group has been declining, and this report shows that as well. Aerial insectivores as a group, they show a 43% decline on average since 1970. But if we look at the shape of those lines, there is a little bit of a twist, because aerial insectivores, the decline seems to be leveling off, or for some species, even starting to trend upwards. Now, this sort of raises more questions than it answers, because we don't really know why that's happening, and it caught us all a little bit by surprise. But it is certainly a hopeful sign. These birds are definitely not out of the woods. Their populations are much lower than they historically have been, but this may be a sign that all is not lost for aerial insectivores. Things are changing. Maybe something we're doing is working. And so it's important to understand what's causing this change and to keep working to conserve aerial insectivores and bring those populations back to where they should be. Story number 4, we have 2 new groups this time around. So in the previous 2 State of Canada's birds reports, I should say, These groups were not included, and now we are able to include them for the first time. The first of those groups is long distance migrants. So these are birds which migrate to tropical places, places like Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and in a few cases across the oceans. And these birds have declined on average by 29%. When we compare that to shorter distance migrants, which have only declined by 12%, and resident birds who spend their entire year on their home range here in Canada have actually increased a little bit by 9%. So there's a real difference here. And that tells us that something is going on with these birds that fly great distances that seems to be affecting them more than the other birds that we have here in Canada. Now, there's a few potential issues. Obviously, the journeys they take are a little bit perilous, but maybe the biggest issue for these birds is that they are vulnerable to threats like habitat loss, kind of in three places. If we imagine our little blackpoll warbler here spending its summer in the northern Canadian boreal forest and then migrating down to South America, it can be affected by threats in the Canadian forests, on its stopover sites that it uses in migration, and where it spends its non-breeding season in South America. So the conservation of migratory species is tricky, and it requires international collaboration, some of which Birds Canada is absolutely involved in, so that we can protect these birds in all parts of their annual journey. Our fifth, sorry, not our fifth story yet. I caught myself off guard. The second half of our fourth story is Arctic birds. I did say there were two groups that are included for the first time in this report, and Arctic birds are one of those groups as well. Bit of a tricky story in Arctic birds because when you look at this graph, it's a little bit all over the place. Arctic birds as a group, they are the second line from the bottom there, 28% decline since 1970. But when we break them apart, we see a real mix of stories. We have Arctic geese and swans kind of skyrocketing. These species are maybe actually benefiting from warming in the Arctic, which is a little bit counterintuitive. On the flip side, Arctic shorebirds have declined, and that certainly tracks with what we already know about shorebirds. All the remaining Arctic birds, they've declined by about 13%. So we do have maybe some warning signs here with our Arctic birds that things maybe are not perfect in the Arctic. But the biggest issue with this group is that they are difficult to monitor. These birds live in remote places in a lot of cases where there are very few people, and it can be very difficult to keep track of what's going on with them. And so we need continued monitoring efforts in these remote places to make sure we get the whole story on Arctic birds. Now our fifth and final story, and a good one, and that is that there are three groups of birds in this report which have increased in population since 1970. That's waterfowl, birds of prey, and wetland birds. And this is not only good news, but it's very interesting to me because these groups are recovering. So for all three of these groups in the middle of last century, they were in trouble. A lot of waterfowl species had declined due to overhunting and habitat loss. Birds of prey had largely declined in a big part due to pesticide use, and wetland birds were declining because wetlands very simply were being destroyed. These birds rang alarm bells back then, and conservation effort has made a huge difference for them. So they are a sign to us that if we understand a problem and we make an effort, we work towards solving that problem, we absolutely can. And when we look at those other groups of birds that have declined in this report, that can be very alarming and it can be very upsetting and sort of make us wonder if there's hope. But we know that there is hope. We know that we can change the trends for those birds because we've done it before. And these three groups are proof of that. Now, that is our big five stories, but I'm going to sneak in a sixth one because I do think it's very important as well. And that is that the majority of the data that underpins State of Canada's birds come from citizen science. And I'm sure we have a lot of folks on the webinar today who are citizen science participants. And you should know that if you participate in things like breeding bird survey, Christmas bird counts, atlases, nightjar surveys, owl surveys, all that stuff, your data and all the hard work that you've done feeds this report and lots of other important things as well. So if you are a citizen science participant, thank you for doing what you've done and keep it up because that data is so, so important to understanding what's happening to birds in Canada and if we're being successful in our conservation efforts. So a very important thing to remember as well. Now that brings me to the end of my little introduction here. If you haven't had a chance to check out State of Canada's birds yet, I hope that you will. Maybe we can throw the link in the chat, and after this webinar, you can browse to your heart's content. But otherwise, I will turn it back over to Andrea to transition us into the Q&A.
Thanks, Kyle. Man, it's a lot of really good information to take in. Some a little bit disheartening, but some really positive stuff as well. And it's a huge effort, right? Like this is a lot of work. Could you give a little bit of insight into what was involved in creating the State of Canada's birds?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andrea. It's an absolute ton of work. I think it looks like a ton of work, but also it maybe is even more than it looks like in a way. The State of Canada's Birds is several years in the making, and it's a huge collaborative effort by a very dedicated team from both Birds Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, and a lot of input from external folks as well, and a ton of effort by the citizen scientists who underpin this whole thing because we're drawing on countless hours of citizen science data. In terms of the work that happened in the actual production of this resource, there's a lot of facets to it. There's the coalition sort of management and analysis of all the data by some very, very smart people to produce these trends and all this information that we see. There's the production of those species accounts, which are a massive resource. So there's tons of expert analysis going into that by a bunch of people. There's the technical aspect of creating the platform and hosting the report and hosting the accounts and all of that. It just goes on and on and on. So it's been a real labor of love, a real all-consuming project in recent times, and it's been a lot of work, but it's been a lot of reward as well. Now seeing it out in the world and seeing people digesting it and reacting to it and taking from it the messages that we certainly hoped that people would.
Yeah, it must feel so good to have it out there now and be getting this feedback and be
It
able to
really
share
does.
share all this information. Yeah. You did mention at the top of your presentation, but you mentioned it again, these species accounts. I've played around on the website a little bit. I've like dug into some of my favorite species to see how they're doing. But I wonder if you could share just like why these are so cool and help everybody understand what's the deal with the species accounts.
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad that you asked as well, because I think that what folks are mostly seeing of the state of Canada's birds is the report. And there's great reason for that, because it's absolutely the place to start. It's that key summary. It's beautiful. It's like definitely the thing you should see first. But don't sleep on those accounts. Those species accounts are an incredible resource and a unique resource as well. So as I said, I think earlier on, there is a species account for every species of bird which regularly occurs in Canada. So that's 463 accounts. And each one is absolutely crammed full of information. It draws on the best currently available data that we have, and it adds a ton of expert analysis. So you're finding real analysis of the trends in the populations of those birds, what's happening to that species over time. You'll find population goals. So the State of Canada's birds assigns a conservation goal for each species to help guide conservation effort. And then it analyzes how those birds are doing relative to that goal. You will find maps that you can sort of generate for species. So distribution and occurrence maps you can generate in different ways. And you'll find access to that trend data as well. So you can view those trends from different monitoring programs. You can download the data if you're a researcher and that's useful to you. You really are tapping directly into the Nature Counts platform, which is Birds Canada's open data platform, and it contains hundreds of millions of bird records and hundreds of thousands of trends. So you're getting that direct sort of tap in, that access to Nature Counts and to all this incredible expert analysis as well. So if you haven't checked out the species accounts, definitely do. I think they make a really important resource for anybody wanting to learn about birds in Canada. If tomorrow I woke up and I wanted to learn about a wood duck, I might go to the Audubon All About Birds account, or I might go to, the Cornell All About Birds account, or to Audubon's website or something like that. But they're not going to give you that Canada-specific information. They're not going to give you that really in-depth population breakdown and trend information. So this is an excellent complement to what's out there and really a unique resource that you should definitely explore.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, like the species accounts are really truly awesome. Worth everyone checking those out. After the presentation, we've got some Q&A coming in. We've got more to chat about. So I am seeing questions about grasslands. That's of course one of our big takeaways. And lucky for all of you, I've got our grassland conservation manager, Ian Cook, able to join us here. Now, the findings in the state of Canada's birds they impact his work in a huge, huge way, but also your day-to-day life, Ian. Like you live in the prairies, you see these declines. I'm hoping you could give some insights into what your big takeaways were from this report and what is Birds Canada doing and what are you doing in the field to address these declines?
Yeah, no, you're right, Andrea. certainly through the course of my work and even in my personal life living here in Western Manitoba, I see the impact on the landscape and see the thousands of hectares of grasslands that we lose on the prairies every year. I'm seeing that impact on the landscape. And, that really is the big story here, as Kyle mentioned, that it's the loss of habitat. So for birds like Sprague's pipit, for instance, when they're singing their song, their unique descending song high above the prairies, you can seem to hear it for miles and miles. But what they're doing is they're staking out a territory on a larger grassland that needs to be around at least a hectare in size. So every one of those thousands hectares that we're losing every year is a lost potential home for a grassland bird. So one of the big takeaways that I have from the state of Canada's birds is the urgency of the work that we're doing on the grasslands, and it underscores the importance of the focus that Birds Canada has put on grassland bird conservation over the last several years. So you asked about what we're doing. Well, we're doing monitoring. We've done over 7,000 bird surveys across the prairies since 2021. So that's contributing to science, grassland bird science here in Canada, but also throughout the flyway. We're also working with farmers, ranchers, Indigenous communities, and many other partners, looking at ways that we can address the underlying causes of grassland bird declines. So through policy, we're looking at ways of pursuing policies and looking at the policies that hold the most promise to stem the loss of grasslands and grassland birds. We're also looking at we've also made it easier for farmers and ranchers to access the conservation programs that are available to them so that they can take part in those programs easier and conserve and steward grasslands better. And then we're also, through our work with the Bird Friendliness Index that Pete mentioned off the top, we're working with farmers, ranchers, Indigenous communities, and we're looking at ways that we can address the underlying causes of grassland bird declines, understanding what are the challenges to those producers and Indigenous communities to keep grasslands intact, and looking at ways that we can reward them for the contributions that they're making to grassland bird conservation. So I think the takeaways are that there's a lot of urgency here, but there's also, as Kyle mentioned, I think for me, again, a lot of hope that when we understand a problem and we take deliberate action, we can do amazing things for bird conservation, as evidenced by those groups that are recovering. And though the threats of grassland birds are many and complex, if we set our collective minds to this and we take deliberate action and effective action now, we can save these birds from disappearing from Canada.
That's great. Thank you so much. A question from the audience is, are solar farms going to be a big problem for grasslands?
Yeah, so anything that is going to take up space on the grasslands and sort of disrupt that habitat, any sort of energy infrastructure is going to affect grassland birds because they're so sensitive to structure and they need that space on the grasslands. But as Kyle mentioned, it's also a balancing that we know that climate change is affecting many of our birds, grassland birds included, with the drought cycles that we're seeing sometimes intensifying or lengthening. So it's a balancing act with how you address climate change and also how you limit the impact of energy infrastructure on the landscape. And a good example of this is recently in southern Alberta, where our key biodiversity areas work has helped to address a proposed solar farm that was on a really important place for grassland birds. So we're working to try to mitigate some of those risks as well.
That's great. I've got a question here. I'm very interested in protecting meadows and grasslands along our 4 main migratory routes, particularly for our migrating songbirds. What are the initiatives for this? Now, I know you've touched on it a little bit with grasslands. Do you have anything else to add on that front, Ian?
Specifically, some of the things that we're involved in, there is a large initiative called the Central Grasslands Roadmap that works primarily in that central flyway, that's looking at how we work across international boundaries and really from that from that flyway perspective of how we address the many threats that affect grassland birds throughout their migration. So Birds Canada has been actively involved with that since its inception, really. So that's one of the initiatives. We're also involved with the Prairie Habitat joint venture, which has a focus on wetland and grassland conservation. We've been a part of that for a long time now too. So there are lots of different initiatives, and you can find out some more about some of those initiatives on our website if you visit birdscanada.org/grasslands and find out how our work sort of weaves into some of those.
For sure. Thank you. Kyle, we've had a few people ask about the data deficient species. You said there were 12% are data deficient. Could you list some of the species that would be included in that?
For sure. Yeah, it's spread out a little bit, but the data deficient species are concentrated in those birds that are particularly difficult to monitor, whether that's because they live in a remote habitat or they have a behavior which makes them hard to monitor. So, for example, Arctic birds, there are a handful of data deficient Arctic birds, which makes sense when you think about it, because a lot of them live in vast places where there aren't very many people and they're difficult to get to. Some marine birds, because they spend so much of their lives at sea, are very difficult to monitor as well. So those are two groups where we have quite a few data deficient species. And the rest are a bit spread out, but it tends to be birds, as I say, that are remote in their habitat preference or have some sort of behavior that just makes them really hard to monitor.
Cool. Super interesting. Now we've got a lot of eBird users in the chat by the sounds of things. Folks are wondering if eBird data was part of this whole process.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure there are tons of eBirders here, myself included, and eBird is such an incredible resource. This State of Canada's Birds, it draws on many, many data sources. And what it does well is it uses those data, each piece, for what it really suits. And so when we look at those long-term trends, those sort of 50-year lines, eBird doesn't work so well for those because it's fairly young, right? It's fairly new and not quite as standardized as some other efforts. So when you look at those long trends, those are mostly underpinned by projects which have long-term, really standardized surveys. So things like Breeding Birds Survey, things like Christmas bird counts, and more dedicated surveys like the Nocturnal Owl Survey, Canadian Nightjar Survey, even single species things like the American Woodcock Singing Ground Survey, because they've got those nice long data sets that can be easily compared for a long period of time. And now those are supported by all kinds of other things like breeding bird atlases, marsh monitoring program, and eBird. And eBird especially, one thing it does very, very well is occurrence data. And so eBird especially comes into play on the second tab of those species accounts where you can interact with those occurrence maps. And that pulls in eBird data in a big way. And eBird is also used in the population estimates for a lot of species, which are included in the species accounts as well. So it absolutely is used. And as this resource evolves and draws in more regional information down the line, chances are the use of eBird will increase as well. And certainly as eBird becomes older, it becomes even more and more useful. So yeah, we're definitely see eBird involved and lots of other citizen science initiatives as well.
Oh yeah, keep eBirding, folks. It's
Definitely.
really such a cool app. Now, the long distant migratory birds are new to this report. We've got someone wondering if is that because we now have enough data?
I think for a lot of those species, we probably did have data before. I think it's a bit of a conscious decision simply to include them this time because they're an important group with an important story to tell. I'm sure there's more data now than there were 5 years ago, but that group probably could have been done 5 years ago as well. But it tells such an important story. So there was a real decision to place that up front this time. And especially because the conservation of migratory birds, going way back historically has been a bit short-sighted because, Canada is inclined to work in Canada and the US is inclined to work in US and so on. And in more recent years, there's been a much greater realization that this really does take international cooperation. These birds, in some cases, spend actually a minority of their life here. When you think about an Arctic nesting shorebird, it actually spends more of its life outside of Canada in many cases than inside of Canada. So if we want to conserve that bird, we have to think about its entire annual journey and how we can work with the other places where that bird lives to sort of take this collaborative approach to conservation. So yeah, a deliberate decision to include them this time simply because of that story and how important it is to tell. And we need to really be thinking about migratory bird conservation for sure.
Yeah, really work together to help our species, no matter where in the world they are. Ian, the grasslands, the prairies, they're huge. Are bird species territories typically on private or public land? And if the birds are on private land, how do we manage or change behaviors to protect those habitats?
Yeah, it's a mix. So both public land and private land are really important to grassland birds. So where and many of those both private and public lands are often managed by cattle producers. So grazing livestock is one of the main mechanisms that we have to keep grasslands intact on the Canadian prairies. And when they're well managed, cattle can create the habitat conditions that these grassland birds need. They need some short grass, they need some tall grass, they need that heterogeneity in a grassland to to carry out their life cycle and have that healthy grassland bird community. So and that work on private lands is a lot of what underpins our work with the Bird Friendliness Index and looking at some of these policies, because that's where we're seeing the biggest losses in grassland habitat. And so with the Bird Friendliness Index, we're working with farmers and ranchers to develop a tool that can help them understand how their management is impacting grassland birds, and then they can set goals and work towards that. But it also could be inserted within a market landscape and help reward these producers for the good things that they're doing for birds, and then make make a lot more sense for them to incorporate birds when they're making their management decisions on their farms or on their ranches.
Excellent. Thank you. I've got a climate change related question. Someone's noticing the chickadees near their cottage there's maybe fewer of them right now or than there compared to what there used to be. But are they moving to different habitats? Are they changing because of climate change? They're kind of wondering how climate change is causing birds to shift their habitats. Are they staying over winter versus migrating? Are we seeing that kind of information in the state of Canada's birds? Kyle, I'll toss that to you.
Sure. Yeah, and it certainly climate change is having an effect on birds, absolutely. And to some degree, there's an element of it that we don't fully understand. I mean, this is a new and evolving phenomenon. We definitely see some birds from the south moving further north, expanding their range northward. Here in the east where I am, something like fish crow or black vulture is expanding its range northward, likely due to changing climate. And we see some species from the north where the southern edge of their range is sort of retracting northward or retreating northward. The big case study for that here in Ontario is Canada jay, which is having a problem at the southern extent of its range. Canada jay, it creates food larders, so it stores food over the winter. And what's happening in the southern extent of its range is that the climate in the winter is warmer and it fluctuates more. And so that food has the opportunity to thaw over the winter and actually rot. And so their food larders don't last. And that's causing Canada jay in some places to retreat northward. So we absolutely are seeing impacts of climate change in a very real way. And there's probably a greater impact even than those sort of anecdotes would provide that we're only beginning to understand. So it's definitely a scary thing for our birds, and we're going to see more changes. And the key really is to reduce as many other pressures as we can on these birds so that they have the best ability to adapt and to sort of persist through these changes. So there are elements of climate change we can't quite affect, although we can still fight it as best we can and slow it down and limit it as best we can. But we need to reduce as many other pressures as we can on our birds so that they can adapt to the changes that are definitely coming.
Yeah, climate change definitely a threat across the board. Another big one we've seen a lot of in the news is avian flu. Could you speak to what the effect of that has been?
Sure. Yeah. So avian flu, you might have heard of it in the news, avian flu or bird flu. What we're talking about is highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. You sometimes hear the acronym. And this is an infectious disease that affects birds, all birds, although it's particularly seems to be particularly bad for things like colonial nesting seabirds and waterfowl and birds of prey for some reason as well. And these are the groups that we see most affected by avian flu. It's again, even more so than climate change, is a fairly new threat to our birds. And so we are seeing some effects. There's been some significant outbreaks in seabird colonies that have caused quite a bit of mortality. But there's a lot of unknowns in terms of avian flu and what its effects may be going forward. It seems that birds like those seabirds are able to recover from sort of a single season decline like that. But is this going to happen over and over again? Is this going to create increasing pressure on these birds? So that's definitely something we need to learn more about. Environment and Climate Change Canada is tracking the disease. So if you find sick or dead birds that you think may be affected by avian flu, you can actually report them to Environment and Climate Change Canada. There's a link to that in this the State of Canada's Birds report. And you can help to track this disease because there's lots that we don't yet know about how severe its effect will be on birds in Canada, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Ian, bison, pretty cool species. I've got a question if there's any initiatives with reintroducing bison to create conditions for grassland birds.
Yeah, there's a lot of great work going on with a number of indigenous communities throughout the prairies on bison rematriation or reintroduction, and lots of indigenous communities working together to exchange knowledge on how to do that. The Buffalo Treaty, which is a treaty across indigenous communities, both north of the Canadian-U.S. border and south, on essentially a treaty to work together to reintroduce bison on the landscape. So yeah, there is a lot of really great work that is going on that front. Yes.
Awesome, thank you. More curiosity about the data deficiencies. Kyle, could you name a couple of bird examples in the Arctic and marine categories that we're lacking information for?
You're going to test me on specific examples. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I can pull them up with great confidence, but definitely in the case of marine species, they're really interesting because when we think about seabirds in Canada, we might think about things on the East Coast, for example, like shearwaters, or on the West Coast, like albatross. But the majority of these species don't actually nest in Canada. You know, they nest on remote islands in the Southern Hemisphere, and they visit Canada in their non-breeding season, which is our summer here in many cases. And so those birds, you know, they're even difficult to monitor in their breeding range sometimes because their breeding colonies can be quite remote or their behavior around the breeding colony can be secretive. But they're even more difficult here in Canada because they're just out there in the ocean in Canadian waters, sure, but offshore and very difficult to follow around and know what's going on. So, you know, I'd hesitate to name species, like I say, in case I get it wrong, but definitely a lot of those non-Canadian breeding seabirds, that's a place where we really are short on data, just because they're very difficult to follow around and monitor in the open ocean. And so that's one area I can definitely with confidence say. I know there are a bunch of Arctic birds, but like I say, you'll overly test me here and name an individual species.
Okay, well, maybe this one's a little bit easier. Or maybe it's not. How many resident birds are in the report, you know, versus the short distance and long distance migrants? And is there a place that we can go and find them?
Another good question and another test for my memory and my knowledge of the finite detail. I can't remember exactly how many there are in the group, to be quite honest. But you can, if you view the State of Canada's Birds website, you can explore the methods. So you can find the methods for the report, how the species were grouped, and you can sort of figure it out there. The other thing you can do is the species accounts. So when you scroll down to the bottom of those species accounts, if you're curious about whether a certain bird was included in a certain group or that sort of thing, on the bottom of the species accounts is a card that links you to the report, and it says this bird was included in these analysis groups for the report. And so that's one way you can kind of explore that as well. So there are a few ways you can get at the information there, but I don't recall the number in resident birds specifically.
Totally fair. We have had a lot of really good questions. There's still some more coming in, and I'm afraid we might run out of time. But you can always follow up with us and ask us questions behind the scenes because we're always super keen to help out. But before we go, I really do want to get into a super important one. What can people who are here with us today do to help birds? Kyle, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, a great question and a very broad question.
Yeah.
I think I'll preface this by saying that it is not a one size fits all, because everybody's circumstances are different, right? People live in different places, they have different resources available to them. Everybody's different. So there's no one size fits all answer to that. The best thing you can do, the absolute best thing you can do, is to learn more, because you learn what fits your situation, what you can do in your life. And a great way to start doing that, shameless plug, is the State of Canada's Birds Report, which provides a lot of information both on what you can do to help those groups of birds, and at the end, what you can do to help birds in Canada as a whole. So there's lots of good information there and good links. I think if we're talking about like the most effective things that individuals can do, I might pick on something like keeping your cats indoors. So if you're a cat owner, I think that's the single easiest and single most effective thing you can do, because you simply keep the cat inside or outside in a catio or on a leash. And that reduces a significant amount of bird mortality, because cats, as much as we love them, and I really, really do, they do kill birds out there. So keeping them inside is great. Treating windows, if you are a window owner, treating windows to avoid bird collisions, because windows are also a significant cause of mortality for birds in Canada. So that's a real on the ground thing you can do. And I think I would also look at anything that helps to create or preserve habitat. And that's going to be different for different people, because as I say, we're in different circumstances. But if you own property, if you own a yard, planting native plants is a great way to do it. You could volunteer in your community for programs or projects to help to preserve or create habitat that way. So anything that you can do even on a small scale to help create or preserve habitat is going to have a great effect for birds. So definitely, those are three things. I know there's a million things, and maybe Ian has other ones to add, or you, Andrea, have other ones to add as well. But maybe I'll cut myself off at 3 for now.
Yeah, Ian, was there anything you wanted to add to that list?
Yeah, I think specifically for grassland birds, and Kyle has touched on it, and it works for broader bird, like the broader bird groups as well. That really we need to demand action from our governments and from our representatives on bird conservation, and particularly for me in the agricultural landscape. And we need to address some of these underlying causes that are causing grassland bird decline. So letting your local politicians know, your MLAs, your MPPs, your MPs know that this is an important issue for you, and that you want to see action on climate change, habitat loss, those things that are contributing to bird declines.
Yeah, huge. So we've got some individual actions, we've got some really big, large scale things to do. Personally, I love to plug the, do whatever you can for climate change yourself. Plastics, reduce plastic pollution can really help birds. And I am a piping plover nerd. So if you're out on the beaches and there's shorebirds hanging around, just keep your dogs leashed in those areas. Let the birds rest, let them relax, whether it's a piping plover or your regular shorebird. As we've heard, they are all kind of struggling. So giving birds space on shorelines, that's one of my favorite things to plug. We're going to have to wrap up, folks. But as I said, don't hesitate to reach out with other questions that we maybe didn't have a chance to answer. But first, get out and explore that State of Canada's Birds. You can get it at stateofcanadasbirds.org. Thank you all so much for joining us today from across the country. There are tens of thousands of you working to support bird conservation in Canada, whether it's donors, volunteers, or even just coming out today to learn more and show your support. This all means so, so much. Together with you, we are the voice for birds.